We met an unloved Acorn Atom recently and learned about its origins. It's a British micro from 1980, a filthy example of which landed at the collective that I think deserves to retire with dignity. And that's what we'll give it today. A fitting care home, a bath, a service and a fitness test before displaying it in our museum and sharing its history with our visitors. That means tackling both the machine and that crazy power supply we saw in part 1, and bringing together the skills of everyone here to get the job done, be that electronics, scrubbing or stickers, to take it from trash to treasure. We start with Holly's help today to give the system a look over before we consider putting any power through it. And as it's all socketed, it's a straightforward task to check a common point of failure, and that's the RAM. Holly's owned an Atom and is a big Acorn fan, so I'm happy to be led by her on these checks and to give any crusty RAM sockets a clean as we go. Now the tester we're using is an Arduino based 2114 RAM tester, and it takes about 45 seconds to check all of the memory addresses in each module for errors. But basically all we need to know is that if it gives us a green light, it's a good RAM chip, or at least by the rudimentary tests that it does, and if it gives us a red light, it's a failure. Press the button, sip some tea, wait a bit, dunk a biscuit maybe, and then we can see that that's a good one and we move on to the next. And in this example we can see we get a red light, so immediately we found some bad RAM, and that was well worth checking these out. I wonder how many more will fail. The answer was 2 dead RAM chips in total, and those were easily replaced by chips on our other Atom with the busted keys. And of course we checked those RAM chips, got the green light, and had a full complement of RAM chips to put in the Atom. As Holly continues to poke and prod for issues, I got to work on the filthy case, which had a fine cement dust-like covering all over it, as well as these odd rusty spots. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I know plastic doesn't rust, so I'm hopeful that a scrubbing brush will get rid of those patches. But first we'll let the bubbles get to work. That's my usual car shampoo in there to start us off. Some nice warm water, we'll submerge the case and we'll just let it soak for 20 minutes before I start scrubbing. Let's not make this any harder work than it needs to be. Now our Atom, you'll remember, had an expansion port added, which we don't really need for what we're going to use it for. The case had been cut to house that port and the sticker removed, so we'll want to rectify that in this restoration and bring it back to its former glory. Holly desolders the connector from the board, we don't need that anymore, and Dan gets to work making a new sticker. Sorry Dan, decal. He gets upset when we call them stickers. He uses a scan of a existing one as a template and then puts together a whole brand new label using Adobe Illustrator in this case to create a new vector. Now the decal alone isn't sufficient to cover the cutout on the back of the case because somebody might poke a finger through there, so he also 3D prints a thin blanking plate to stop any problems there. The decal then goes onto that plate, ready to be stuck to the case itself just as soon as I've cleaned it up, and I think that's enough soaking now, so let's get to work on that case. You see that? That's made of atoms. That's made of atoms too. In fact, everything in this advert section is made of atoms, which gives us a seamless segue into our PCBWay.com sponsor slot. If you'd like a PCB made from atoms, head to PCBWay.com. They also do 3D printing, CNC milling and electronics design services, most of which use atoms. PCBWay.com for supporting the channel and the museum. We give our thanks right back, Atom. Regulars will know that we've just started a garage conversion project here at the mill, which will include a dedicated workshop space, fixed repair area and cleaning space. I cannot wait to make videos in there. It's really going to be next level stuff when that's up and running. And we'll give you an update on that in just a couple of weeks' time when we've got more to show you of the progress we've made on it, but it's well underway. For now though, here it's fingertip cleaning and scrubbing with this thing. But I'm pleased to see the dirt is shifting quite well on the first pass, and there is a nice consistent cream coloured case under all that filth. That case was designed by industrial designer Alan Boothroyd, who would also create the BBC Micro and Acorn RISC PC cases, and he was based in Cambridge, which was also key to Acorn's success. Chris Curry of Acorn said in an interview in 1982, "We're in Cambridge because the University Processor Group, or its computer lab, has maintained Cambridge as one of the leading universities in computer science. So there is a good supply of bright people to go into the industry. One of our directors is a lecturer at the computer lab, and he is on the watch for good people about to leave that might work for us." So that ready supply of brilliant people primed for the micro industry was invaluable to Acorn's success, as it was to other companies in the area, such as Sinclair. I'm pleased to see the rusty spots are lifting now, albeit slowly. So I'll go at that with a little bit of abrasion from a magic sponge and then a little bit of sift to try and get the last of it off. Now, also important to Acorn's success was the continuity of their products. The Atom Basic was a slight variation of the Basic used on their first product, the System 1 from 1978. The 6502 CPU would be a staple in their range until the Archimedes in 87, when they switched to their new ARM CPU. Curry actually thought of the Atom as a far more serious machine than Sinclair's offerings, which he painted as consumer units, while Acorn's were to appeal to a more serious application. "Apple is much more our competitor than Sinclair," said Curry. "Ours is a company with diverse interests, having customers in the consumer, development, education and office sectors." And it's fair to say that Sinclair had the same ambitions. It's just that his was such a low cost and had such an availability of games that it became the de facto low cost gaming micro in the UK. Now, I'm happy with this transformation. With a bit of scrubbing, that's come up really well. So let's get back to Holly, who's now tested all of the RAM, and we're doing a very rudimentary in-circuit check of the capacitors here. And by rudimentary, I mean we're simply seeing if they identify as a capacitor or not with our component tester. If they don't even register as a capacitor, then things have gone badly wrong. And through that test, we did find one that didn't register by the memory sockets over here, looking a bit crusty. So we'll swap that out now for a new one. In it goes. And we also removed the remains of a snipped composite mod, only to have a track completely disintegrate in the process of the removal. So that wasn't ideal, but we do want the option of a composite video output, so we checked the schematics and we patched our cable in at a slightly different place on the board, but it will do just the same job. And that gives us our composite output as well as the standard RF. All that's left for Holly to do now is put all of our good RAM chips back in. Dan now pops the decal on the back of the clean case. Looking good and solid enough not to worry about it getting damaged there thanks to that 3D print. And the keyboard is up next, and that's a tricky customer, not because it's dirty, but because it's integral to the system PCB. It's not a separate keyboard that we can detach, and it's not even using regular key switches that we can swap out. Now, this was an interesting cost-saving approach that gives the impression of it being more robust than it actually is. Let me show you on our beaten up Atom over here with the missing keys. Under the keycaps we can see a plastic frame, and within that for each key are 2 springs, which I'll try to get a light under here, and you can see just about there's 2 springs in there, and there's a bit poking in the center, and what happens is those springs actually go through the PCB, and the springs themselves are soldered directly to the underside of the board, and when you press the key you're just squashing those springs together and causing the arms in the middle to make contact to close the switch. And this is what's called a saber coil keyboard. There's very few micros that use it, and it's a pain to service. So I'm going to start with a brush and a clean in situ just to see how operational it is when it's cleaned up. Just like the case, that's come up very nicely. So let's put that back in the case now to test it, but we're going to need a way to power it up. So let's go over to Richard to sort out that power supply. I'm sure this power supply made sense when it was made with care 44 years ago, but I ain't putting that thing in active service, and Richard agrees. So instead, I picked up one of these. This is a little Meanwell RS155. It gives us a single 5 volt 3 amp output, and you can pick them up for about a tenner new. That is more than adequate for our Atom. I'd hate to lose the original project box though, so I've asked Richard to reuse it. And of course, he's 3D printed a new rear plate for it with the Atom logo on it. That's a nice touch, Richard. You can't ask him to do anything without him somehow bringing 3D printing into it. And so with some strain relief, a bit of crimping, a capacitor for the LED and some heat wrap, we end up with something that I'm a lot more comfortable with having switched on for a few hours at a time in the museum. Job done, thank you, Richard. So now we can power our Atom on. Now what I found at this point was that the Atom does work to a degree, and I'll explain what I mean by that. At first I was pleased to see it boot, and I tested the keyboard, and boy was that keyboard crusty. Many of the keys didn't work. Some came back to life after repeated presses just to decrunch what was all caught up under them and in amongst those springs. And then I found for those that just wouldn't play ball, a combination of contact cleaner, more crunching, and then compressed air to clean out the debris got all of them working again, or most of them working again. It was a very repetitive process, but I could feel it gradually getting better and better as I went on, so it was quite rewarding to work through and see all of those keys come back to life. One key simply wouldn't work, and when I took a closer look I discovered that the spring had actually come away from the joint on the underside, so that just needed a touch of solder to reattach it. But the rest just needed a good clean and a blowout. Confident then that we'd been lucky with the keyboard and the system was working, I put it all back together to showcase it. But that confidence was slightly misplaced, as we'll find out in a moment. But as for the cosmetic restoration, I'm happy with how this has turned out. Really, really happy actually. It's cleaned up really well, hasn't it? Dan's work on the rear has tidied that up nicely, and he's matched the green colour of the text perfectly. He did also make a replacement sticker for the right side, but I opted to keep the original there as there's nothing wrong with it, and we don't want to replace it for replacement's sake. We want to preserve where we can. And I decided to set it all up in a cosy nook in the cave to enjoy the Atom. Before I was testing it on our composite mod, we saw that on the Sony TV, but here I've dug out an old National branded TV from the period. It's black and white, but so is the Atom. And we'll tune it in like it's 1980. That looks great, doesn't it? Static and all. But here now is where I ran into issues. I've only got 2 Acorn Atom cassettes to test this thing with. The first is this games pack, and I love that it's got an Asteroids clone in here written by Steve Ferber, who would go on to create the ARM CPU with Sophie Wilson at Acorn. But before ARM, there was Asteroids. Let's give it a go then, and initially it seems happy, showing the index screen of the compilation, which is in the same standard text mode as when we switch it on. And then I load Asteroids, and that does load into memory fine. And then some minutes later I type run to get Asteroids going, and I get a blank screen. Something isn't right, but it could just be the old tape. So let's try another program. And this time this one's called Dogfight. It's a one-on-one plane duel. So let's load that in. And in trying this time, the Atom froze up. And after that point, sometimes I'd get a letter or two to appear, but then it would freeze again until I reset it. I might get a letter or two, and then it would just repeatedly freeze. It really wasn't happy. Now, I was all out of tapes now, so I switched over to my phone to load some programs from WAV files I had instead. And once again, it was happy in text mode with the most basic of programs, but when I tried to load anything more complex, we started freezing up again. So this led Holly and I to do 2 things. Firstly, to test the video RAM, which actually uses exactly the same 2114 SRAMs as the system memory, and we did indeed find another faulty one. So I'm glad we tested that. And then we also discovered 2 incredibly dirty 7000 series chips. Look at the state of this. That caught me by surprise because all the other chips seemed quite clean. Somehow these are filthy. So I cleaned them up too. And from that moment on, our Atom was a lot happier. We've got this little bomber game running here, albeit in text mode, but nothing was freezing up now. It was much more stable and reliable. And then when we tested it with asteroids, it switched video modes and it actually worked this time. From the tape as well, which was nice. And it was a fun little blast. Even if the ship lacked any kind of inertia, which felt a bit odd compared to versions of asteroids that I'm used to, it proved that our Atom was working nicely now. And anything else that I threw at it was happy now too, from a clone of Frogger, in black and white of course, to graphic plotting demo programs. The Atom was rock solid and fully back in service. And it's just a joy to see this 45-year-old machine come to life.
It's a lovely machine, isn't it? It's not going to blow us away with a class-beating demonstration of power for the period, but I think it can be respected for what it delivered for the price, but also the path that it paved for Acorn. Acorn's attitude for evolving their technology, going back to the System 1 through to the Atom, then fed into the Proton, which would be renamed to the BBC Micro when it was chosen as the computer for the UK's computer literacy project. And that in turn fed into the cost-reduced Electron, and I do love that naming scheme, Atom, Proton, Electron. The version of BASIC that they developed that was criticised in that article in part 1 went on to be further developed through the BBC Micro. It was used on the Electron and into their ARM-based Acorn Archimedes, which they released in 1987. And while Sinclair may be remembered as the king of budget consumer computing in the 80s, regardless of what his intention was, that's what his computers, especially the ZX Spectrum, were pigeonholed into being, it was Acorn who were quietly and diligently and iteratively evolving their designs from the System 1 through the Atom and onwards. And the Atom, while it wasn't huge, it's reportedly sold a little over 10,000 units compared to the ZX80's 50,000 units in 1980. If this had all gone wrong, well, 45 years later, your phones may look very different because you probably don't need me to remind you, it was the same company, the same people behind the Acorn Atom that went on to develop the ARM CPU with the Proton, the BBC Micro, that was what was used, the platform that was used to develop ARM, and then put it into their Archimedes machines. So, quiet, little known internationally machine that went on to have big implications for technology for all of us 45 years later. But if we just stick to 1980 for now, when this was released, these were difficult times in the UK, economically very difficult. High unemployment, high inflation, bleak times for some, and the cusp, the introduction of microcomputers in the UK and in the home. And this was a time when people were starting to think, I shouldn't need to know which end of a soldering iron to hold to be able to use a computer. I just want to learn computing. And that's what this computer and the ZX80 and others like it were really pushing at, trying to get it to an affordable price bracket for the market at the time, particularly in the UK, in those conditions, and to make it as accessible as possible. And if you want some more insights into that, check out my interview with Steve Ferber, which I'll link in the video notes here. And he tells a great story of an Acorn Atom owner who bought it as a kit because it was available in kit and pre-assembled form. And he'd heard that heat was bad for chips, so he superglued each chip into place and then called them and wondered why his Acorn Atom wouldn't work. You may laugh, but these were the people that wanted to get into computing, and why shouldn't they? And these were the kind of computers that were trying to usher those customers into a computing market. So it played an important role along with all of those other low-cost 80s UK micros at the time in achieving that. And then that had some rocket boosters strapped to it with the UK's computer literacy project and Acorn's BBC Micro. A whole other series on the channel about that as well, which I'll link to too if you want to learn about the next step that Acorn took. And finally, it's very nice to see 3 Acorn machines lined up here, having all received the Trash to Treasure treatment. Each of these has had its own series. Don't they look lovely? And I guess we really should do an Acorn Archimedes soon to continue that chain. And that will also bridge the gap to the Acorn RISC PC, which is also featured on the channel We've had plenty of Acorn on the channel over the years, but I think we do need to get that Archimedes on there. And quite right too, because it's a very important company and beloved here in the UK, even if it wasn't as sexy or dazzling or as exciting as some of the other micro companies out there. As always, thank you for taking the time to watch. If you'd like to see this or anything else that we've covered in the channel, come and visit the cave sometime. Come and visit the Retro Collective, the arcade archive as well. Just head to retrocollective.co.uk to book a ticket, see when we're open, and come and say hello and have a cup of tea, and I can tell you more about this when you're here. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Please subscribe if you haven't already done so, and we'll see you next time. Take care, bye-bye.